Are you ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
We're going to go to Galatians 5. What I want to do first is just read the first 15 verses. Then we're going to have a quiz. It's not going to be tough, not going to be difficult. Simple questions, just simply based on the text we're going to read. So it's a comprehension type test. And it'll be an open book test, so it'll be easy. Let's start reading in verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith the Messiah has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, the Messiah shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. The Messiah is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. For we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Yeshua the Messiah neither circumcision avails anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which works by love. You did run well. Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion comes not of him that calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in you through YAHWEH that you will be none otherwise minded, but he that troubles you shall bear his judgment, whosoever he be. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Then is the offense of the stake ceased. I would they were even cut off which trouble you. For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. So only two questions on this quiz. Question number 1. Paul wrote that we have been set free by Messiah. Did he in any of those verses say specifically that it was the law we'd been set free from?
No, sir.
Are those two words ever used together? Set free and law? Any of that? All right. He mentioned being in bondage and warned against being entangled again by that bondage. Did he say that the law is what men were in bondage to?
No, sir.
It's not there, is it?
No.
However, there are myriads of people who read these verses and then believe and then teach that these verses are telling people that the law is bondage, we've been set free from it, and we don't have to keep it. They teach that the law is bondage and that Yeshua set us free from that bondage. If we read these verses and just let them say what they say, then we have to conclude two things about those who believe such things. If somebody teaches that this passage says the law is bondage and Yeshua freed us from having to keep it, they're lying. These verses don't say that. If someone believes that this passage says that the law is bondage and Yeshua freed us from having to keep it, they're believing a lie. Those doctrines which so many teach and that so many believe are not written in these verses. These verses, we then agree, do not say the law is bondage. We then agree they do not say that keeping the law is bondage. And we agree that these verses do not say that Yeshua set us free from having to keep the law. Those things are not in this passage, but it's amazing. Last night, Marie and I were driving back from Odenville, and I just went to Galatians 5 and went to playing one sermon after another off of YouTube. It's amazing how many of them immediately start talking about how the law is bondage, and Yeshua said, well, they say Jesus set us free from it. And yet the verses never say any such thing. So if somebody's persuaded that it does, then I would borrow Paul's phrase from verse 8 and say that persuasion does not come from him that called them. Right. It came from somewhere else, right? It's not the Bible that persuaded them to believe that. It's not Galatians 5 that persuades men to believe that. It's not Yeshua or Yahweh that persuades them to believe that. If they believe those things, then they have chosen to believe things that are contrary to what's written in the Bible. So what we're going to do this morning is go back over this passage and do what we've been doing, and that is go verse by verse and see what it actually says. So let's start again in verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Yeshua has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. There is no doubt that Yeshua sets us free. And there's no doubt that we must put forth effort to remain free. Paul said, stand fast. Right. That is a command instructing us that under all circumstances and in all cases we're to plant our feet and remain in that condition of liberty. There are going to be things, there are going to be forces that will try to move us back into bondage where we become entangled again by that bondage. And Paul said against those forces, resist them, stand fast against them, don't let them push you back into bondage. That phrase alone makes it plain that Paul's not talking about the law as being the source of the bondage. The Galatians were Gentiles. Paul is warning them about slipping back into entanglements of their previous bondage. No Gentile had spent their life entangled in Torah. Right? So how could they become entangled again in something they never were tangled up in to start with? Right? Right? So there would be no need to warn them about being entangled again in Torah. Anyone who wants to know can know what Paul meant when he referred to and spoke of bondage. It's real easy. You don't have to read Galatians 5 and speculate on what he's talking about. He identifies himself what he's talking about in Galatians 4. Okay? Look in Galatians 4 and verse 8. Talking to the Galatians, he said to them, howbeit then, when you knew not Yahweh, you did service to them which by nature are no Elohims, are no gods. Mark that phrase, you did service to. Verse 9, but now after that ye have known Yahweh, or rather are known of Yahweh, how turn you again? There it is. Remember in 5:1 he talks about being entangled again. You turn again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage. So verse 8, he says you did service. This is the Greek word from doulos. Doulos is a bond servant or a bond slave. So he says you were slaves. Doulos. Doing the work of a doulos, a slave. What were they slaves to? Serving gods that weren't really gods. They were slaves to serving gods that were not really gods. And notice the question in verse 9. How turn you again to these weak and beggarly elements and desire again to be in bondage? So you can't take Galatians 5 and arbitrarily say that when Paul speaks of liberty, he means liberty from the law. When Paul speaks of bondage, he means bondage to having to keep the law. You have to let Paul define his own words and explain his own sentences. He's already told us in chapter 4 what the Galatians were in bondage to. It was a life devoid of any knowledge of Torah, any knowledge of Yahweh. They were in bondage to those spirits that drive the world to worship demons in the form of gods. They were in bondage to certain ways of worshiping those gods. You did service, he said to those. Paul said in chapter 4 and again in chapter 5 that Yeshua set them free from that bondage and they should not return to it. They should not return to two things. They should not return to the worship of these pagan gods, and they should not return to the forms of worship used to worship the pagan gods. Those forms of worship are bondage. Let me say it this way. Those forms of worship are bondage. Right? If you get entangled, use His word here. Think about it. Think about your own life experience. If you get entangled by Santa, by wreaths, by Yule logs, by decorated trees, by bunnies, by dyed eggs, by sunrise services, those things are a bondage that it takes a Messiah to set you free from.
Yeah.
You can't free yourself from those things in and of and by yourself. Their hold is too strong. The power behind them is too mighty. It takes a Messiah to set you free from that bondage. And if you are free, you can't pat yourself on the back as if you've done some great thing in and of by yourself.
Right.
You have to raise your hand and you have to voice thanksgiving that He who did set you free.
Amen.
Had He not, we'd all still be in bondage.
That's
right.
Because our eyes were blind, our ears were deaf, and our hearts were hard.
Right.
Yes.
We looked at it for decades and decades and decades and never saw anything wrong with it. It took a Messiah to break those powers so we could see the truth.
Amen.
Wow. So when we look at Galatians 5:1, all we have to do to understand what Paul meant is go back and read what he said in Galatians 4:8 and 9. The bondage is pagan forms of worship used in service to pagan gods. And if you do not stand fast, you can get lured back into it and entangled again by those powers of darkness associated with those practices of darkness. Verse 2. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you be circumcised, the Messiah shall profit you nothing. Behold. When a man starts a sentence that way, he means to get your attention. Paul wants to make sure that the Galatians hear clearly his next statement. He's not just making this statement out of the blue. He's making this statement to nullify a lie that the Galatians are being told. Think about it now. He didn't just think, okay, I'm going to write him a letter and I'm going to talk about this. He is writing a letter, making statements to nullify lies that somebody else is telling the Galatians.
Right.
Somebody else, then, if you read this verse, then you have to conclude somebody else is telling the Galatians if they'll get circumcised, Yeshua will profit them. Paul said if you get circumcised, He will not. They said if you do, He will. This word profit. In Matthew 5:6, it's the word used when it talks about the woman with the issue of blood, remember? It said that she had spent all her money on many physicians, and it says, and was nothing better. No improvement at all. Same word. Word translated better, same word translated profit. So somebody is telling the Galatians that if they get circumcised, Yeshua's ability to bless them will be better. It'll be better for them, spiritually speaking. They'll improve. Their spiritual condition will improve if they'll just get circumcised. This word is also used in John 12:19 when Yeshua is making his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. The Pharisees are watching as people are taking off their coats and throwing down palm branches and they're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of Yahweh. They're watching all of that, and here's what they say. Perceive ye how you prevail nothing. Behold, the whole world is gone after him. Perceive ye how you prevail nothing. The word translated prevail there is the same word translated profit here in Galatians 5. So we can conclude then that somebody's telling the Galatians if they would be circumcised, Yeshua would be able to prevail in their lives to a greater degree. He could work greater things in your life if you'll just get circumcised. False preachers often manipulate people to do things by appealing to their selfish desires.
That's true. Very true.
They find out what that person selfishly wants,
Right.
and they use that against them to get what they want.
Very true.
They talk people into doing things they might not necessarily want to do by promising them some blessing they cannot get unless they do the thing that they're being told to do.
Right.
In our day, the most common thing false teachers do is manipulate offerings out of people.
Right.
They promise them that that particular offering is anointed, and if the people will give right now and give a certain amount, then they will receive a special anointing in their lives that come connected to that offering.
Right.
You've heard it.
Many times.
Right now, hurry up, phone lines are open, or hurry up right now. The anointing's here. You got to move. You got to bring that offering now. Don't hesitate. It's got to be in faith. Bring that offering. It's got to be a certain amount. Got to be right now. And if it does, there's an anointing right now going to be released in your life, and a blessing's going to come.
Right. Yep.
That's precisely what the Judaizers are doing to the Galatians. They know that grown men don't want to be circumcised.
That's very true.
But they're promising them. Just come do it. Come do it anyway. You love Yeshua. You know what He's done for you. Oh, He could do so much more if you just get circumcised. Now, it's one thing to take out the checkbook and write a check for X amount of dollars and not get the blessing you were promised.
Yeah.
How many times you ever done that?
Yeah.
But it's entirely another thing to allow yourself to get circumcised because you believe that it's going to open up some special spiritual blessing to you, only to find out that after you were circumcised, it did not bring that blessing.
Yep.
So Paul is warning the Galatians, the Messiah will profit you nothing. Paul's simply saying to the Galatians, do not allow these Judaizers to manipulate you into doing something by convincing you the Messiah will give you a special blessing if you do it. They're lying to you. With that in mind, let's read the next two verses. Verse 3. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, he's a debtor to do the whole law. The Messiah has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. What is grace? Divine empowerment from YAHWEH. Okay? So, if you understand the definition of grace, these verses make complete sense. Focus on this phrase. The Messiah has become of no effect unto you. To be of no effect, this word is used in Mark 7:2 when he talks about that the Pharisees had made the word of YAHWEH of none effect. No effect means to render something idle. Render something idle. How many of you have power tools? Yeah?
Yeah.
Think about a drill or think about a circular saw. They have great power. They are able to accomplish great things if you plug them in and if you pull the trigger. But if you never plug them in and you never pull the trigger, you have rendered them idle. Right? Useless. They are incapable of accomplishing a task they are designed to accomplish just because you've rendered them idle.
Yeah.
That drill won't drill a hole. Well, that's because you didn't plug it up and pull the trigger. Right?
Right.
You can go out in the driveway here and there are automobiles out there with 200, 300 horsepower. Right? It's built to do great things if you put a key in it and turn the ignition, put it in gear, mash the accelerator. Right? But if you keep that key in your pocket, that automobile is rendered idle. Paul warns about rendering Yeshua idle. He sets us free from man-conceived ideas of how to worship. He justifies us by His substitutionary sacrifice. He empowers us to worship YAHWEH in spirit and in truth. If we're deceived into believing that there are also things we have to do in order to fully be justified in the sight of YAHWEH, then we have rendered Him idle. Yahweh gives divine power for us to walk in spirit and to worship Him in spirit and truth. When we say what Yeshua did for us is not enough, we're rendering Him idol, and now we're back where we were before, coming up with our own ideas of how we can please Yahweh. It's like when we come up with our own ideas of how we're going to please Yahweh, it's like taking a drill bit and twisting it in your fingers and trying to drill a hole while the drill lays idle. Or taking a circular saw blade and spinning it trying to cut a board while the circular saw sits idle. Or loading your family up in your car and going out there and putting them in the car and then pushing it back to your house. You rendered everything under the hood idle, right? We cannot justify ourselves.
Right.
Nothing we do will justify ourselves. You cannot become more justified by doing something more. Either you're justified or you're not. Right? Yeshua paid it all. All to Him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. That is what Paul meant when he used the word debtor in verse 3. If we think we still owe something in order to get justified, if we think that Yeshua paid most of our debt, but He did not fully justify us, and we're not fully justified until we get circumcised, then we don't understand what Yeshua did.
Right.
Paul said, I testify again to every man, he's had to say this more than once, that is circumcised, he is a debtor to do the whole law. So what Paul's saying is, if you think that some part of your debt was not paid, and you're going to have to pay that part yourself, you just rendered Yeshua idle, and now you have to pay the whole debt yourself. If you want to pay one part of it, you got to pay it all.
Right.
You understand? You can't say, well, he paid most, but I've got to pay this little bit. It's not how it works.
Right.
I hadn't thought about this in years, but y'all remember when Shoney's was big?
Yeah.
Dude, some of the young ones may not.
Yeah.
But I was pastoring a Baptist church. I'm 20 years old in Argo, Alabama. And after the service, I was new there. A couple of families wanted us to go out to eat. And so we go out to eat, and there was a successful businessman there. I mean, it's me and Marie and two families there eating. And when the bill came, Bob, successful businessman, took the ticket. And I said, no. I wasn't used to that stuff. I said, no. I'll pay for mine. He handed me the ticket, said, okay, then pay for them all.
Yeah.
And I swallowed hard because I couldn't pay it all. And he saw the look on my face. He said, you want me to pay it? Yes, sir, I certainly do. And he was gracious enough to do it. Taught me a lesson.
Yeah.
But that's a lesson we need to learn in the faith as well.
Right.
We can't pay part of our debt.
Right. Right. It's good.
We have to depend upon Yeshua to pay it all. And if we say, well, I'm going to pay part, then Yeshua becomes idle and says, okay, then you pay it all. Well, I can't pay it all. Well, then get out of my way. Right. See, we're either justified by faith or we're justified by works. You can't mix the two.
Right.
You can't say, well, I want to be justified by faith with a little bit of works. No. You're either justified by faith or you're justified by works. And that's Paul's point, okay? You have to choose one. If you need help choosing, choose faith.
Right.
You won't make it the other way. Verse 5. For we through the faith wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Yeshua the Messiah neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which works by love. Those who were circumcised before they were saved still needed to be saved.
Yes.
And those who were not circumcised also needed to be saved. The circumcised didn't need to be less saved. And those who were not circumcised did not need to be more saved. Yeshua did not have to pay more to justify the Gentiles than he did to justify the Jews. It was the same debt for both, right? He paid one price for all. He didn't have to pay more for the person raised in a Baptist home than he did for the person raised in a Satanist home.
Right.
They both owed the same debt.
Right.
Okay? Now watch Paul ask this question. It's a great question. You did run well. Who hindered you that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion comes not of him that called you. Let's start with a few observations. First one being this. Truth cannot ever be something that you just believe. Truth is something you have to obey.
Right.
If you're not obeying it, then you don't believe it to be true.
That's true.
If you believe it to be true, you'll obey it. Then notice, if you're not obeying the truth, then you need to ask yourself, why? If you say, well, I do believe truth, and I love truth, but I'm not obeying truth, why am I not obeying it? Who has prevented you from doing so? Who has persuaded you not to obey it? This word translated hinder here is a Greek word that means to beat something back, like to push something in the chest and to beat it back. The Greek word here means to beat back. It is used in Greek literature to refer to storm force winds and waves beating against a ship. The ship is headed on a journey and it has set its course and it's running well, but a storm comes and the wind and the waves begin to beat the ship back from off its course. That's what that word is used to refer to. So Paul's saying to the Galatians, y'all were on course. You were running well. But who has come now and beat you back so that you no longer are obeying truth? The sad thing is, it doesn't take much persuasion to beat some people back. Some people will see the truth, you can show them the truth, and they'll say, wow, didn't know that was in there. And then 5 minutes later, after talking with their preacher or their deacon or their mom or their somebody, their grandpa, all of a sudden they've been beat back from obeying the truth. It doesn't take much to beat some people back. The reality is, though, when you look at this, it's never the one who calls them that persuades them not to obey truth. YAHWEH will never try to persuade you not to obey truth. Right. Yeshua will never try to persuade you to not obey truth. The Ruach HaKodesh will never persuade you to not obey truth. So if a person chooses to not obey truth, they've either been persuaded by men, by demons, or by Satan, or their own heart, right, to not obey truth.
True.
If you see it in the Bible and you see it as true and you're not obeying it, then who persuaded you? It wasn't YAHWEH, it wasn't Yeshua, and it wasn't the Ruach HaKodesh. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. There is no such thing as a harmless lie or a little lie. In this case, the subject circumcision. And Paul knows that if he gives in and allows people to believe that they need to be circumcised to be fully saved, then he's opening the door for more lies to be taught. Right. Right. That's how Halloween got into the churches. A little leaven leavens a whole lump. You see, Xmas and Easter opened the door for Halloween to come on in. Where it might have been rejected as being totally and completely satanic because the other satanic stuff got baptized and made it look so pretty, folks thought, well, we could baptize this too. Right. That's how homosexuality got into the pulpit. It got there because the pulpits taught, the law passed away. And if the law passed away, then a little leaven Leaven's the whole lump. Verse 10. This is awesome. I have confidence in you through YAHWEH that you will be none otherwise minded. But he that troubles you shall bear his judgment, whosoever he be. Paul says in a letter, writes it down so it's there, recorded forever. Paul said, I have confidence that two things are going to take place. Number one, I have confidence that you're going to see the truth, obey the truth, and get your thinking straight. You're not thinking right now. Somebody's beat you off course, but I have confidence that you're going to get your thinking straight. Number two, I have confidence that the ones who are lying to you are going to be judged severely by YAHWEH. Yeah. They're going to be condemned and damned by YAHWEH, and they will bear it. That's what he says. You will. Verse 11. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Then is the offense of the stake ceased. And as I was saying, the Greek word for cross is storos, and storos means a pole or a stake. It does not mean a cross. Verse 11, the Judaizers are lying and telling the Galatians that Paul also believed that a man had to be circumcised in order to be justified. And Paul said, if I truly believed that, then they'd stop persecuting me. They persecute me because I don't believe that. He said they persecute me because of the offense of the stake. The word translated offense there is the Greek word scandalon. And scandalon referred to the trigger inside of a trap. If you've ever set a trap has to have a trigger. Something that when the animal comes in, he bumps it or steps on it or sticks his nose against it. And when he does, that trigger releases the door behind him and catches him. Whatever that trigger is, the Greek word for it is scandalon. We'd call it a trigger. They would call it scandalon. And that's the word that Paul used here, and it got translated as offense. So Paul, what he said is, when it comes to these Judaizers, I know how to trigger their persecution. It's real easy. All I have to do is start preaching on how Yeshua was nailed to a stake, lifted up between heaven and earth, died as the Lamb of YAHWEH, and thereby took away the sins of the world, both Jew and Greek. All I got to do is talk about what his substitutionary death on that stake is about, and they come after me. Because in their mind, they cannot imagine a Messiah that had to die that way. So he says, I trigger them when I talk about him. And I talk about him because it's true. Verse 12. I would they were even cut off which trouble you. Well, alrighty then. Paul said, I wish that those who want you to cut off parts of your body were just cut off altogether. I would is an interjection. So when Paul makes this statement in verse 12, he's saying it with great emotion. He is saying, oh, that they were circumcised from us, cut off and cast away from us. For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Well, here in these verses, there's more evidence that Paul's not talking about the law as being bondage. Read Paul's warnings. When Paul writes, he clearly states that the flesh does not like to obey Torah. That the flesh will not submit to YAHWEH. that the flesh wars against the Spirit. Read the writings of Paul. Paul clearly states that the Spirit leads people to walk in obedience to Torah, leads people to submit to Yahweh, that the Spirit wars against the flesh. So if Paul says here that we're not to use our liberty as an occasion to the flesh, what is he saying? He is saying that Yeshua did not set us free from the bondage of transgressing Torah just so we can go back to transgressing Torah. We have been set free to walk in newness of life. We've been set free to fulfill the law. We have the love of Yahweh shed abroad in our heart, which allows us to fulfill the law. Read it again. Look in verse 13. For brethren, you have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. Listen to verse 14. All the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love is the key. We don't walk in love so that we don't have to obey Torah. The only way to obey Torah is to be moved by love. All of Yahweh's instructions are about love. Every Torah command is rooted in love. When our eyes are open and we read a command or instruction from Torah and we finally understand, then our attitude is, oh, that's how I love my neighbor as myself. If I see his livestock gets out, I put it up and keep it safe until I can return it. If I see his livestock has fallen in a ditch, I help to get it out and to mend it. I don't covet what he has. Right. I don't steal from him. I don't murder him, because the love of Yahweh shed abroad in my heart. Now I understand how to do that. I read the command. It's not, hey, you have to do this. It's, oh, I do this if I love him. Right. Wow. Men lie when they say they cannot keep Torah. Keeping Torah is all about the love of Yahweh being shed abroad in our hearts. If you take everything Paul is saying here, see, he says stand fast in liberty, and then you read these last three verses that we have in our text this morning, you see that the liberty he is talking about is the liberty to walk in love and obedience to Torah. What's the word I'm looking for? When I hear people say, and it's become a very popular thing to say, well, nobody can keep it, right? Yeah. That's the reason people say we don't have to and shouldn't, because, well, nobody can keep the law. It causes my jaw to get tight. It's not that we cannot, it's that we do not love enough to do so. Right. When a man says we can't keep the law, by those words he's condemning Yahweh. Right. When a man says we cannot keep the law, they're saying that Yahweh was wrong to give us all of these commands. He told us to do things that he knew that we couldn't do, so he had to fix it. True. Yeah. They're condemning him as if all of our problems are his fault. Yeah. True. How dare he give us instruction that he knew we couldn't keep? Well, we'd condemn any parent that did the same. Right. It's true. Right. Starting back in July, I went to taking Will, my oldest grandson, to the gym with me. And the first few weeks were just a matter of getting him used to the exercises we would do. Every exercise has a proper form, proper technique. It's not so much about moving the weight as it is learning the proper form and the proper technique. After several weeks of doing this, we're doing an exercise which is just a deadlift. It's a basic exercise, a deadlift, where you load a bar up, you reach down, you grab it, and you come up from the floor with it. It's great for strengthening your core, your back. It's just a tremendous exercise. And we've been doing those for a while. But on this particular day, after he had done some, I loaded the bar up with more than he had ever done before and with more than he weighed. I loaded the bar up. And then I stepped back and I said, do it. I could tell from the look in his eyes and the countenance on his face, he thought I'd ask him to do something he couldn't do.
Right.
But he was going to try. And so he reached down, he grabbed the bar, and he went to go up, and the bar barely jiggled, and he stood back up and said, Papa, that's heavy. I said, well, you forgot all about form and all about technique. And you just tried to lift that up with your back. I wouldn't ask you to do it if you couldn't do it. Reach back down there. Remember your form and your technique. Plant your feet correctly. Reach down, grab it, flatten your back. Do not try to lift that weight. You push the floor out from under you. Determination came on his face. He reaches down, he grabs that weight, and up he came with it. When just a few seconds before, he didn't think he could do it. If I train him how to do it, the longer we're together, the better and stronger he's going to get. Because I'll never ask him to do something that I think he can't do. And I'll never ask him to do something without showing him the right way to do it. Right? It's the same way with Yahweh. He doesn't ask us to do things that we can't do.
Right.
What if I loaded the bar down with 400 pounds and told Will to lift it? And he couldn't lift it. So I spend the next 30 minutes condemning him because he couldn't lift it. Come on, boy. How come you can't lift that? Can't believe you failed. This is ridiculous. How long do you think it would take the people in that gym to have a very low attitude toward me?
Right.
How long do you think it would take before his parents pushed me aside and said, no more training with you?
Right.
Because I'm being unjust and unfair and ridiculous.
Right.
Well, that's what people accuse Yahweh of being.
Right.
He gave us all these commands. He knows we can't keep them. No, He gave us the commands because He knows we can keep them.
Right.
We're just forgetting form and technique.
Right.
We're reading them and thinking, ugh. And He's wanting us to read them and say, oh, that's how I love Yahweh with all of my heart, soul, strength, and mind. That's how I love my neighbor with myself. I can walk in love toward them by doing this thing.
Right.
That's what Torah is about. When he says stand fast in liberty, he is saying stand fast in the love of Yahweh that empowers you to keep Torah.
Amen.
Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace, as His name is put upon you. So shall He bless you.
Yes, sir.